You're all very welcome to the Grieve School. Before beginning, I'd just like to remember Dr. Alf O'Brien, who was an early member of the committee of this school. Alf was a medieval historian in the University of Cork who passed away recently. Our emergency exits are over here where he came in, and there's one right down the back. So in the unlikely event, as I say, of an emergency, that's the way to go, whichever is nearest to you. It's my pleasure to introduce John Boyd. John is the director of the campaign against Eurofederalism in Britain and is well known to quite a number of people in Ireland, of course. John was a personal friend of Desmond Grieve's, and I've asked him to give a short introduction to the session which will recall some of Desmond Grieve's views on the EU and various other related items. So it's over to John.
Thank you. As one of the diminishing band of people who knew Desmond, and there are some other people in the room that knew Desmond, I would like to say just a few words about his work and the role in the opposition to the common market, the European Economic Community, and what is today the European Union. Now, Desmond opposed the common market from the day it was first thought of. Desmond edited a newspaper in Britain called the Irish Democrat, and which was the journal of the Connolly Association in Britain for over 40 years. And I was a member of the executive of the Connolly Association and worked alongside him on the Irish question, as did several other people here. If you study the columns of the Irish Democrat, and it is on the website, you will find a constant stream of material exposing and opposing the common market. He not only sort of worked on the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland, but this is one of his other major themes that he worked on. The principle behind this material is the right of nation states to self-determination, national independence and democracy. Alongside this is the belief, based on the fundamental principles of the greatest socialist these islands have seen, namely James Connolly. That is, the class struggle includes attaining the right of nation states to self-determination. Connolly made clear that you would not have the right and powers to establish socialism if you wanted it without independence and national democracy. The Connolly Association in Britain, under Desmond's leadership, organised public meetings on the common market, and we had several in Liverpool and London. These were primarily to inject into the labour movement an understanding of the magnitude of the reactionary nature of the European Economic Community at the time and its threat to democracy and the rights of nation states, as well as economic damage as well. In 1986, Connolly Publications produced a pamphlet called The Murder of British Industry. It was hoped the trade unions would pay heed to the clear message in this pamphlet, where capital investment would move jobs and industries out of Britain, and if this was not exposed and opposed, then unemployment would follow, which is precisely what happened. Desmond encouraged myself, an Englishman, with others to set up an anti-common market campaign in Britain oriented towards the labour movement. This was just one of a number of initiatives which Desmond encouraged in his lifetime, apart from the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland. This aspect of Desmond's contribution needs amplifying, and if you want to know more, you can find it in this pamphlet, which is available on the bookstall and is available free. It's an obituary of Desmond Grieve's. The campaign against Eurofederalism in Britain was eventually set up in 1991 and has as its journal, and it's no accident, called The Democrat. a sister to the Irish Democrat, and it is oriented towards the labour movement. It includes pensioners, students and Democrats. This campaign itself is based on Connolly principles as expounded and further developed by Desmond Greaves, and the campaign would not have come about without his encouragement and foresight, even though he died in 1988. The anti-EU work in Britain has suffered the same blind spot as the Irish question, which is really an English question, namely the need to remove the border between the 6 counties and the 26 counties, and the blind spot is not seeing the need for a nation state to have simply the right to self-determination and national democracy, and that you cannot have this yourself if you dominate another country like England or Britain does. Both my own campaign against Eurofederalism, the National Platform of Ireland, and the Irish People's Movement, like Hammerson of Iceland and many other movements across the continent of Europe, are part of the EU critical movement known as TEAM, which Patricia McKenna is now chairman, and she's sitting in the front here taking a picture of it. That brings us to our speaker tonight, who comes from a small country, Iceland, with a population of 317,000. I come from the London Borough of Ealing, which has a population of around 1/3 people, and it's very difficult for me to appreciate and understand the difference in politics between a London borough amongst 10 million people and Iceland with a small population. Without doubt, the people of Iceland have, by and large, made clear they don't want to be bullied and dictated by larger countries like Iceland or like Ireland. This is especially so when the large old imperial nations have combined together in a temporary alliance to have their political and economic way over smaller nations. Iceland has stood firm over fishing. It fought the British Royal Navy, and more recently stood up to the big corporate banks and the bullying of other governments, and they should be congratulated for this, and our speaker no doubt will expand on that point. Our speaker tonight is Ragnar Arneids, who was a Minister for Finance of Iceland from 1980 to 1983. He has been an Icelandic MP, twice a cabinet minister, and was chair of the Icelandic People's Alliance from 1968 to 1977, and is a member of the board of the Icelandic Central Bank. He is a founder member of Hamsin, the national organisation opposed to Icelandic membership of the European Union, and was its chair from 2002 to 2009, and he tells me tonight he's handed the reins across to younger people, and a couple of these younger people were at the team meeting in Stockholm earlier this year. Ragnar is going to talk about the Euro and the European Union and the independence of Icelandic banks, and where Iceland and its people stand today on the question of the EU. Please give a hand to him.
Mr. Chairman, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure for me to have the opportunity to visit your country and to be with you today to discuss Iceland, the EU, and the Euro. As you know, the Icelandic people and the Irish have a lot in common. Both are small nations, but the Icelandic one is 12 times smaller, just 300,000 people. In both countries, the annual population growth is quite promising, and in fact outstanding by European standards, which means that we are not in the group of aging nations. A millennium ago, both nations were independent and both came under foreign rule. Ireland a little before the year 1200 and Iceland a little after. Both nations gained a limited independence after the First World War, and both became republics roughly 2 decades later, Iceland in 1944. When Iceland was first settled 11 centuries ago, quite a large number of people came to Iceland from Ireland and other Celtic regions, according to the Icelandic sagas. Genetic research on blood types shows that as many as 1/3 of the settlers may have been the Celts, mostly women, brought to Iceland by the Norse Vikings, by force in many cases. Ever since Iceland acquired a written language in the 11th century, a strong literary tradition has been a dominant force and a characteristic feature in Icelandic cultural life. I am quite sure that this is in part a heritage from our Irish ancestors. The geographical size of Iceland and Ireland is similar, and their names differ just by 1 letter, which often gives rise to misunderstanding in remote parts of the world. But there are also obvious differences. Ireland is often named the Green Island, while Iceland is mostly barren uplands. Only a small part of it is habitable, and a mere 1/4 of the country is covered by vegetation. So agriculture in Iceland is a rather small scale in comparison to Ireland. On the other hand, fishing is the most important industry in the country. The fishing grounds around Iceland are some of the richest in the world. The continental shelf, where warm and cold ocean currents meet, is very wide and creates an ideal environment for the growth of fish stocks. Iceland is, as you may know, amongst the most active volcanic spots in the world. This is caused by the fact that the country is nature's showcase of continental drift, where America is sailing away from the European continent and filling the empty space with volcanic lava. Therefore, Iceland is growing a little bit every year. Just under the middle of the country, there is a huge pillar of fire and glowing lava. It is 60 miles wide. If this pillar disappeared, Iceland would just sink into the gap in the ocean formed by the tectonic plates. Iceland's active volcanoes number in the hundreds. Ice is also a key characteristic of the country. Glaciers cover about 11% of land, lava fields a similar amount, and barren volcanic sands even more. Recently, the people of Europe were reminded of the fact that Iceland is a country of ice and fire. The fact that a volcanic eruption in Iceland can stop air traffic throughout much of Europe is due to the volcano lying under a glacier. Like so many of the largest volcanoes in our country, deep down inside the crater, the titanic battle of the ice cap with molten magma led to massive explosions, pulverizing the glowing lava and throwing hundreds of tons of lava and ash into the air every second. Volcanic eruptions are often costly for Iceland and for our neighbors also. In a major eruption which started in the year 783, approximately 20% of the Icelandic population perished. At the same time, the ash cloud in the atmosphere affected the climate of mainland Europe, leading to crop failures. French peasants faced starvation, and many had to abandon their farms. The resulting social unrest culminated in the French Revolution. Through the centuries, it was a common belief in Europe that the home of the devil was under Iceland, and that one of its volcanoes, Mount Hekla, was the mouth of hell. Last winter, the British were quite irritated with the neighbors in Iceland. It was not only that air travel was halted by the ash from Iceland, they had also lost several billions of pounds in the Icelandic bank collapse. And we heard them shouting over the ocean, "Please, we want cash, not ash." But what has all this to do with the question of Iceland, the EU, and the euro? Both the ice and the fire are enormous natural resources. The cold glaciers collect water vapor from the Atlantic Ocean, and from them flow many mountain rivers which we use to generate electricity. Geothermal steam and hot water coming deep from underground are immeasurable and inexhaustible resources of energy which are now harnessed to heat more than 90% of houses in Iceland. The steam is also our second source of energy for electrical production, which per capita is the highest in the world. These natural resources are a public property in Iceland, owned either by the state or by local communities for the benefit of the people. But it is quite clear that in the environment of the EU rules on free movement of capital, our natural resources could soon be bought up by multinational concerns. The same goes for the marine resources around Iceland. Fish and fish products are of greater value from Iceland than any other nation in Europe. The exclusive economic zone around Iceland, inside the 200 nautical mile limit, is nearly 300,000 square miles. That is more than 7 times the size of the country. Reflections and concerns about our natural resources are the most important factor in our debate on the EU. Icelandic fishing policies have largely been a success in terms of sustainability, unlike the EU Common Fisheries Policy, which has led to overfishing and the severe depletion of stocks in Western Europe. At the same time, the fact is that the transfer of power from the member states to Brussels is one of the main characteristics of the EU. In the Lisbon Treaty, Article 1:12, it is clearly stated that the Union shall have exclusive competence in the management of the fisheries and other marine biological resources under the Common Fisheries Policy. We know for sure that the fishing grounds around Iceland are a tasty and tempting morsel, especially for the Spaniards. It is also an inviolable EU rule that the EU takes over the right of the member states to negotiate and make fishery settlements with other states concerning the species that are not local but are caught in and outside the 200 nautical miles. For example, herring, capelin, redfish, and mackerel. The value of that catch is just about 1/3 of the total value of Iceland's fish products. Therefore, the transfer of the negotiating powers to Brussels would also be a very unfortunate step for the Icelandic fisheries. In October 2008, Iceland's 3 largest banks collapsed almost overnight. During the run-up to the collapse, the exchange rate of the Icelandic krona fell dramatically and the price of foreign currencies went up more than 100%. Before we deal with the currency question and the euro, it is appropriate to analyze the collapse of the financial system in Iceland and what can be learned from it. The pro-EU lobby used the collapse of the krona as the ultimate argument for Iceland to apply for membership of the EU. For a while, polls showed growing support for EU membership. The argument was that the Icelandic krona was to blame for the disaster, which would never have happened if Iceland had been a member of the EU. In the summer of 2009, the Icelandic Parliament decided to apply for membership of the EU. Is it really true that the Icelandic krona was the main cause of the devastating fall of the financial system? Of course not. It was the other way around. The collapse of the banks caused the fall of the currency. In course of time, such propaganda proved to be far too idiotic for the Icelandic people and is now hardly heard. In the report of the special committee appointed to investigate the collapse of the banks on behalf of the Icelandic Parliament, the national currency is not pinpointed as one of the causes. So why did the banks collapse? The committee's report states that the explanation is first and foremost to be found in the bank's rapid expansion and the subsequent size when they fell. Their balance sheets and lending portfolios expanded beyond the capacity of their own infrastructure. Management and supervision did not keep up with the rapid expansion of lending This is a direct quote from the report. The three Icelandic banks were originally owned by the state. Their size was appropriate to the Icelandic economy, and their financial position was relatively stable. When Iceland concluded the European Economic Area Agreement with the EU, together with Norway and Sweden, Finland and Austria, Iceland became a part of the EU's internal market, undertaking to follow EU rules of free movement of capital across the borders in the EEA area. After that, the banks were privatized, just after the turn of the century. The new owners were three groups of Icelandic businessmen who embarked on a rapid expansion of the banks in the international market. Only 6 years later, when the banks collapsed, the size of the banking system was approximately 10 times larger than it had been before the privatization. And it was 9 times the size of the Icelandic gross domestic production, GDP as they call it. Or in other words, 3 clumsy giants stood up in a tiny boat. That story had to come to a sticky end. The summer of 2007 saw the onset of the international financial crisis. It hit in the wake of unusually low real interest rates and easy access to loans. These circumstances led to growing weaknesses in the international financial system. The major markets were rendered virtually inoperable, and this proved especially difficult for the Icelandic banks, which were increasingly dependent on funding through international markets. As the winter of 2008 progressed, share prices fell. Foreign creditors made margin calls. The death march of the banks to their own grave had started. In the autumn 2008, the Lehman Brothers Bank collapsed. It was the largest bankruptcy in the history of mankind and had a global catastrophic effect. The collapse of the 3 Icelandic banks, which took place a month later, was of course much smaller than that of the Lehman Brothers Bank. And it did not have the same effect in the international market. Nevertheless, the Icelandic catastrophe is ranked as the 3rd largest bankruptcy, next after the Lehman Brothers Bank and Washington Mutual. Further down on this list, we find WorldCom, General Motors, Citigroup, and Enron. This is hard to believe, bearing in mind that the Icelandic economy of 300,000 inhabitants is one of the smallest in the world. But why did international financial markets open their doors to the Icelandic banks? There were mainly 2 reasons for this. Firstly, they did it because of the bank's good credit rating, which the banks had inherited from the Icelandic state. The state did not have a heavy burden to bear at that time, before the collapse. But now, today, it has lost its favorable rating. Secondly, the banks had access to European markets on the basis of the EEA agreement. Now, after the collapse, it is widely recognized that the EU rules on banking and bank accounts in foreign countries were quite faulty, especially the EU legislation on deposit guarantees, which gave rise to complicated dispute over the Icesave bank deposits between the Icelandic government and those of the United Kingdom and the Netherlands. The dispute is still unresolved, and last winter the Icelanders rejected in a referendum a payout plan that would have cost every household in Iceland around 45,000 euros in the form of higher taxes. 45,000 euros per family. The committee's investigations also revealed that the operations of the banks were in many ways characterized by maximizing the interests of the largest shareholders who manage the banks, rather than running solid banks with the interests of all shareholders in mind. In all of the banks, the principal owners were among the largest borrowers and had abnormally easy access to credit at the banks they owned. In the legal proceedings which are now taking place, that kind of behavior has been called robbing the banks from the inside. It has also been disclosed that the banks purchased their own shares on a large scale in automatically matched trades in the stock exchange, attempting in this manner artificially to boost demand for their own shares. This was particularly the case after share prices started to drop. Now, you might be inclined to ask me whether the deteriorating situation of the banks could not have been foreseen by the authorities from the capital ratio of the banks. The fact is that in the annual reports of the banks, the capital ratio was always considerably above the statutory minimum. Half a year before the collapse, the banks underwent classic stress tests similar to those which were used last summer in Europe and attract a lot of attention. The Icelandic banks received very, very good grades in these tests. After the collapse, the investigation showed that the banks had secretly invested their funds in their own shares. Therefore, the capital ratios did not reflect the real strength of the banks to withstand certain setbacks. Generally, it is impossible under such circumstances to estimate the real strength of a financial institution from the capital ratio. On the other hand, the investigation committee did point out that when the banking system had become far too big relative to the size of the Icelandic economy, the public authorities did not react. It would have been necessary to take action no later than 2 years before the crash, if there was to be any chance of averting the collapse of the banks. But instead of focusing on the obvious problem that the Icelandic financial system was far too large, The only thing the government did was to try to improve the image of the banking system by official statements abroad. Both the parliament and the government lacked the political power and the courage which were needed to set reasonable limits to the financial system. The mainstream opinion in the society was strongly in favor of the sacred EU rule of free movement of capital over the borders. All energies were directed at keeping the financial system going. It had grown so large that it seemed impossible to risk the collapse of even one part of it. Or, to put it plainly, when the bubbles started bursting and greed gave way to fears, there was no way to save the banks. In the spring of 2008, the Icelandic government and the central bank tried to borrow quite a large sum abroad in order to save the banks. But only the Danish, Norwegian and Swedish central banks were willing to enter into currency swap agreements with the Central Bank of Iceland, and the amount which they offered was just a fraction of what was needed. Today, we Icelanders should be grateful that our state was not able to undertake these gigantic loans in order to save the banks. A huge salvage loan would have ruined the Icelandic state finances forever. This year, the Greeks have been in a similar situation. And some other countries, as you know. The difference is that the population, for example, of Greece is 35 times that of Iceland. So, what were the effects of the financial collapse? Of course, it is rare for the whole banking system of a country to crash completely. All business transactions with foreign companies and banks became extremely difficult. The Icelandic banks had branches in many countries whose governments reacted in different ways. To make things still more complicated for Iceland in these days, Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling decided to put our oldest bank, Landsbanki, and the Central Bank of Iceland on the official British list of terrorist organizations. That is to say, the key institutions for the Icelandic economy stayed on that list for months together, just up on the list, together with Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, the Taliban in Afghanistan, Sudan and Iran, and maybe North Korea. These measures were especially hard for Iceland to cope with in the international market. For a long time, all foreign currency transactions were operated not in the banks, but by a little group of people on one floor of the Central Bank of Iceland, and they went through the international firm E.P. Morgan, which took over everything which had to do with foreign transactions. In the middle of the crash, the Icelandic parliament passed emergency legislation which authorized the government to establish new clean banks, replacing the bankrupt ones, and to set up currency restrictions. These restrictions are still in force now nearly 2 years later. I need not tell you that the emergency legislation is in conflict with the EEA agreement and some basic principles of the EU. But the fact is that the law has not yet been put to a theoretical test. I have spent a lot of your time giving an account of the Icelandic financial collapse because I think it might be an interesting phenomenon for you here in Ireland and the serious banking problems you have to deal with. The banking business is so complicated that most often the criminal side of it is not exposed except in a case when a bank is declared bankrupt. The Icelandic bankers were the disciples of their colleagues in other countries, and their behavior discloses the huge insolence, greed, and criminal activities which take place behind closed doors, not only in Iceland, but certainly also in the modern banking world outside Iceland. But the Icelandic disaster is also a crucial event in the context of Iceland and the European Union, especially because of the profound impact it had on the Icelandic people's opinion of EU membership. In the years before the collapse, many people were impressed by the achievements of the Icelandic businessmen and bankers and the fantastic growth of their firms. They were buying big companies all over the world, mostly in the UK and France, in the Nordic countries, in Eastern Europe, Balkans, and Asia. They became large owners, not only in the telecommunications, in many airline companies, and in the food market, and a number of well-known clothing stores on London's Oxford Street belonged to them. Also toy shops and jewelry stores. These fantastic investments contributed to a rapid rise of asset prices in Iceland, as witnessed by the fact that the Icelandic Stock Exchange Index more than tripled in few years. But parallel to this globalization, the business community in Iceland was crying for the EU membership and the euro. When the wind of change started blowing through the banking world and stock prices began to decline, the EU propaganda was intensified. People were told that the EU would save us from our problems, and just the application alone would change everything for us. Then the house of cards came tumbling down. At the start, the effect was a general despair among people and a political chaos. But shortly after the collapse of the banks, the outcome of the opinion polls began to reflect substantial changes in people's attitudes towards the EU. And when Parliament decided to apply for membership, we already had the paradoxical situation that the majority of the voters were opposed to joining the EU club. These changes in opinion were in fact quite logical. People were getting their feet back on the ground. The pseudo world of the EU propaganda were no longer casting its spell, and more people understood that the most important thing for us in Iceland was to build up and strengthen our own industrial production in order to be able to scramble our way out of the burning wreckage. This leads us directly to the question of our currency and the euro. Individuals and firms which have had foreign debts were hardest hit by the dramatic fall in the exchange rate of our currency. On the other hand, a low rate of exchange is very helpful and in fact a necessity for a nation which needs to be encouraged to save money and not to buy too many imported goods, but rather to produce and export. Without the adjustment Iceland has achieved through its national currency, the country would certainly be in a crisis situation for a lot longer than is now the case. Today, nearly everybody is admitting the fact that the weak currency is helping the economy of Iceland rise from the grave. Just like a jeep inching its way up a steep slope in a low gear. Of course, it will be a slow process, but we will make it and get there in the end. Those who want Iceland to adopt the euro must also face the fact that a long time will pass, even decades, before our state can fulfill the conditions of the Maastricht Treaty and be able to introduce the euro, particularly because of the national debt. Additionally, several factors point to the conclusion that the EU is not a practical monetary union, let alone a practical solution for Iceland. Economic circumstances in the member states are very different, but the interests and the needs of the largest states are given priority by the common monetary policies of the euro area, while small states get into a vicious circle of too high exchange rates and unemployment, especially in the remote areas. The debate on Icelandic membership of the EU is nothing new in our country. When I started professionally in politics 50 years ago, I was already making speeches opposing Icelandic membership of the European Common Market, as its name was then. 8 years ago, we founded a cross-political No to EU organization in Iceland. Its name in Icelandic is Heimssýn, meaning a view of the world, view out to the world, can you also say. And until last year, I was leading it. Besides the question of the natural resources and the currency, we have been emphasizing how disastrous it would be for future generations should we give away the rights and the powers associated with our independence. The decision to join the EU cannot be made with short-term goals in mind, such as temporary economic crisis or problems with the value of our currency, the krona. we must think decades ahead and remember that it was because of our very independence that our nation succeeded in improving its quality of life from being one of the poorest countries in Europe a century ago to one of its richest at the start of the 21st century. For the average Icelander, the EU is so remote in space and time that many do not realize that the EU is not an ordinary international organization, but has been developing for the last 6 decades and has gained all the main attributes that define a state. Nothing indicates that this development has run its course. It seems that the ultimate goal of inducing member states to hand over important aspects of their independence to Brussels is the building of a new superstate. The rights of the member states will in the end be similar to the states of the USA. They have autonomy in certain areas, but limited independence. The fact is that the powers of small states in the EU are decreasing little by little, the powers of big states increasing. The transfer of power to the EU would be more deeply felt in Iceland than in any other EU state, both because of the unused energy resources we have, and because the fisheries are such a large part of the Icelandic economy. In the fullness of time, Iceland could be and become like a small county in a superstate. We also point out that the democratic deficit in the EU is enough reason on its own to reject membership. The evolution of power is what modern times call for, but the ever-growing concentration of power in the centralized institutions of the EU, which are barely answerable to the supervising power of voters, is weakening European democracy. The very small participation in elections to the European Parliament shows how distant the commissioners of Brussels are to them, the voters. In Iceland, the voters can throw out a government they don't like, but in the EU, they would have no effect on who would be the new bosses of our citizens. Iceland's distance from the power centers of the EU and the EU bureaucrats' lack of knowledge of Icelandic circumstances remind us how ridiculous it would be for Iceland to be governed from a distance of 1,200 miles, that is 2,000 kilometers. Important decisions regarding Icelandic issues could mill around in the system for long periods, and that could cause the nation a great deal of harm, for example in the fisheries sector, where there is often a need for quick decisions and flexibility. A lot of EU regulations do not suit Iceland at all, because it is such a small society where circumstances are in many ways unusual. The latest and worst example is that a group of businessmen could operate private banks overseas under the aegis of EU EEA regulations. These regulations were made in harmony with the circumstances in states 20 to 50 times larger than the Icelandic state, and proved to be highly toxic for our small nation and its taxpayers. It is of the greatest importance for us in Iceland that laws and regulations for our country takes into account the smallness of the population. Far away to the southwest in the Atlantic, there is another small nation which also has a lot in common with the people of Iceland. That is Newfoundland. In many ways, I think its story is noteworthy. Newfoundland was a British colony, which in the last century gained sovereign status in the Commonwealth, but got into severe financial troubles in the Great Depression and chose to enter the Canadian Union after the Second World War. Through the centuries, the most important industry in Newfoundland was fishing, just like in Iceland. They had some of the world's finest and most extensive fishing grounds, which were also visited by European and American ships. In the 60s and 70s and the 80s, hundreds of big trawlers from 20 to 30 countries fished there. Iceland used its power as an independent state to protect its fishing grounds by extending the territorial fishing limit first to 4 nautical miles, then to 12 miles, then to 15 miles, and finally to 200 miles. Canada was nearly a decade later than Iceland in this development, and when Canada at last proclaimed a wider territorial fishing limit around Canada and Newfoundland, the fish was disappearing. In a period of few years, the catch in Newfoundland fell from around 800,000 tons of cod down to 0, to nothing. The foreign fleet of modern factory trawlers had totally depleted the fishing grounds, just like a vacuum cleaner. In many other sectors, the loss of sovereignty also had a negative effect on employment in Newfoundland. Fresh initiative declined, and many companies in commerce, banking, and communications became branches from large enterprises in Canada. In recent decades, unemployment in Newfoundland has been very, very high. The gravest consequences of an economic depression are the situation when the economy gets into a vicious circle of protracted unemployment and low economic growth. The smallness of the Icelandic society makes it relatively simple to take rapid action, and the rate of exchange of small currency is also quick to adapt to new circumstances. Therefore, the whole economy has a flexibility which helps it to find the right way out of difficulties. Every disaster, every misfortune has its positive side and can be turned to our benefit. We in Iceland have learned our lesson. The first thing we had to admit was that terrible mistakes had been made. But it could have been worse. The state could have been submerged in debt. Now, 2 years after the collapse, we are gradually getting to our feet. Unemployment in Iceland is on its way down, and at the moment the rate is between 7 and 8%, lower than both in the United States and the average of the European Union, much lower than in Ireland. And the fact is that unemployment in many EU states has been around 20% in recent months. For example, in Spain. But the situation is complicated and we face a lot of problems. That is true. The worst problem is the huge debt burden which fell on the state. But Iceland is not, as you know, the only European state with a troubled economy. A massive transfer of debt from the banking sector onto the balance sheets of nation states has taken place in Europe, not least here in Ireland. And a wave of draconic austerity measures is sweeping over the continent, while everywhere the lords of the financial markets are stealing away from the responsibility. The EU lobby in Iceland quite regularly reiterates that Iceland is in need of the protection of the European Union. It is true that we have no armed forces in Iceland, a weak currency, and the remains of economic chaos and instability after the worst financial crash we have seen in the last 2 centuries. Nevertheless, the Icelandic people are still saying no to EU membership. A year ago, the Icelandic government knocked on the door of the EU. Since then, opposition against membership has been constantly growing, but is now around 2 against 1, which is to say between 60 and 70%. Of course, it's a waste of energy and money to negotiate for years when you know that nothing will come of it. When people are asked in the polls if they want the EU application to be scrapped and withdrawn completely, the overwhelming answer is yes. Everyone in this hall is familiar with the game played by naughty children who ring the neighbor's doorbell. And when he opens the door, they hide and laugh. When the Commission in Brussels opens the door, the Icelandic people will not be hiding. They will give a clear answer, I think. But inevitably, it will sound to the ears of the commissioners like a doorbell prank. Thank you.